this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Josh Weiss, author, speaker, researcher, and renowned expert on leadership, negotiation, mediation, and systemic approaches to dealing with conflict. We resumed the conversation with a discussion about the great gift of no and the 3A trap: accommodate, attack, and avoid. And so you were just talking a minute ago about the accommodation and things like that. And the introduction to the book is titled The Great Gift of No, which I thought was really poignant. And it opens with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that says, "A no uttered from deepest conviction is better and greater than a yes merely uttered to please, or what is worse, to avoid trouble." And then the book goes on to describe the 3A trap: accommodate, attack, and avoid. So you kind of touched on accommodate. Can you touch on attack and avoid as well?
Well, so that's, when it comes to this question of no, people come from those three places. So if you say no from an accommodating point of view, it goes to the Gandhi's quote, right? Which is that basically you're saying yes, even though you know you shouldn't, even though it's against your best judgment to do that. So we say yes because we don't want to harm the relationship. Attack is more of a competitive, it's the leaving bodies in your wake notion of, I can say no and with an attack in an attacking mode. I have no problem saying no, but I've destroyed the relationship. And avoiding is really just, not saying yes or no either. It's sort of on some level trying not to answer because you don't even want to get into the conversation because you're deathly afraid of what will happen. So each one of those has a downside, and so it's much better to engage in the yes, no, yes kind of piece. And not, each one of those is sort of an edge, if you will, that isn't helpful. Accommodating, it's too focused on the relationship. Attacking, it's too focused on yourself. Avoiding, it's not wanting to deal with the problem because you don't want to hurt their feelings or whatever it might be. You don't like to have to say no to people because of the consequence. So each one of those is a bad approach to dealing with saying no. And so what we have to do is move to that, as I mentioned, that yes, no, yes way of doing things.
Yeah, I think another problem with no, when you say it to avoid, and the avoidance, you alluded to earlier, is basically the customer or the other side says, well, I didn't hear no, so that must mean yes, right? Because you didn't answer.
Yeah, and so your expectations, I'm kind of a believer that communication probably should have been called miscommunication, because it's pretty rare when people actually understand what it is exactly that you're saying. And I think that that's the case, particularly, when people come into situations, they have expectations, and we don't do a good job of managing the expectations of the other. And as you just pointed out, if you don't directly confront something, then, by default, you have just confirmed their view on something. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people, when I tell them that, they're like, oh, you're right. Like, I never thought of it that way. I just thought, I want to get off on the right foot. I never thought I would be setting a precedent in that way. But you do, because, unless you're explicit, I'm amazed. A lot of times I feel like I'm being really clear with people, and they'll be like, well, that's not at all what you said. I thought, okay, all right, we got a big problem here, Yeah,
I opened the podcast with a quote: "The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place." Right. And so that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because, and I'm always amazed when people say, well, I was really clear with them. And then I'll go and, I do a lot of mediating. I'll be like, well, what did they tell you? And the other person's like, that's not at all what they said. Right. And so it's almost like they're not having the same conversation.
Right.
It happens a lot, actually, a lot more than people realize. And, this happens a lot at home with your kids and your spouses, right? Where you think you're being really clear. And there's a great story that William tells about a wife who says to her husband, I really want you to spend less time at work. And so he ends up, and he's like, okay, I hear you. And what she meant was, I want you to spend time with me. And he ended up signing up for a golf tournament, right? So, you've got to be excessively clear in your communications, basically.
That's a double negative, right?
Yeah, you're in big trouble.
He's even in more trouble now than he was before.
That's right.
So one of the questions, I think you've actually touched on a little bit of the answer already, but if you do say no to project number 7, so you're saying yes to the other 6, how do we get our customer to accept that no?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a persistence notion there. So what we advocate, because when you say no, the natural instinct of somebody, especially say a client, is going to be like, you do know we're the client and we pay your bills and all that kind of stuff. And it's really a question of almost sort of coming up with a phrase and sticking to it, because that's when you're going to make the biggest mistake is you don't want to damage the relationship. So maybe you come off that no and start thinking, well, maybe I should try to do something. So what you do is you really just sort of come up with the phrase, say, I'd really like to help you, but I just can't do it right now. And you stick with it. And eventually, they're not going to be happy, but, this is also in the context of a larger relationship. And so if everything else is going well and you can't, like I do a lot of work with companies and they're often asked to do sort of out of scope work or things like that. And I say to them, look, I know you want to keep that person happy, but you guys can't have a profitable business if you keep doing that. So it's that persistence factor, because they're going to put on the full court press and say, to try to use all these things to guilt you into it or whatever it might be. So you have to come up with a bit of a phrase that says, I understand it's just not something we can do right now. I'm happy to think creatively about other ways, but we just can't do that. And you got to just keep reiterating. And eventually people will get there and they will be like, okay, I guess this is not happening. There's a woman named Rosabeth Moss Cantor who did some research on, essentially, she came up with something called the curve of acceptance. She did the research and it was actually focused on when people who are told they have a terminal illness, how do they deal with that? But the idea of the curve of acceptance is, and we talk about it from the point of view of hearing the word no, it's a similar kind of process that people go through in their minds, where basically they start out with sort of denial and say, well, you didn't hear me, I'm the client, I want you to do this. It's like, no, we can't do that. And then it moves to sort of anxiety or anger, where they'll be like, listen, I told you, I'm the client, you're going to do this. Can't do it, I'm sorry. And then slowly there's sort of some form of whatever, sadness, acceptance, and problem solving. But it's a process that people go through anytime they hear negative news. And I think if you realize that that's how people process this kind of information, then you give it space. I've learned that to not try to sort of say or do too much. Once I've said the no, like I need to just let them go and process the way they need to. And then I can see, and you can kind of see people moving through these different stages where eventually they get to that place of problem solving and they say, well, what are we going to do now? And that's when they're there and they can, start thinking differently about this. They're accepting that, okay, I guess this person isn't moving off of this, and now what do we do?
Yeah, I think in the book you guys talk about the name game, right? So what you're naming, what that thing they're doing is that anger, is that bargaining, is that guilt,
Right.
all the different things. One of the things that I saw in the book that was really helped me was uncover your yes.
Yeah.
And to do that, we need to really identify what our true interests are. And you kind of did that for me when we were talking about the Neil Young ticket situation, where I was going to try to trade 2 bad ones for 1 good one. But it's important to make a distinction between our position and our interest, right?
Yeah, and I mean, really, and this is for any negotiation. It's for saying no, but it's also for any negotiation in general. Positions are really what people say they want. So I want 2 tickets I want 1 ticket for my 2 bad ones, 1 better one, right? Interests are why, because, it feels wasteful to have 2 tickets and not use 1, or I want to try to improve my, my viewing pleasure kind of thing, right? So interests are the motivations, and we often they're sort of the underlying motivations in negotiation, and they're the silent movers, and they're critically important in any negotiation. And I like to talk about it as sort of an iceberg. That positions are like the tip of the iceberg. They're what you're going to communicate to the other side, but interests are why those things, why that tip of the iceberg is so important. I like to bunch interests into 2 categories. So, again, under the surface, where 90% of the iceberg lives, right, there's all kinds of stuff that's going on for somebody in a negotiation. So the 2 realms that I bunch interest into are sort of tangible and intangible. Tangible are budgets, money, anything you can touch, right? Concert tickets, whatever. But then intangible are the things that make us human, disrespect, being embarrassed, things like that. And those things play into negotiation a lot. I can tell you that, in a lot of the negotiations I've been part of that I've seen fall apart or I've been advising people around, a lot of it comes down to those things of somebody feeling disrespected, someone left out of a process, somebody embarrassed, somebody not knowing how to do something and having to sort of fudge their way through things. It really does happen all the time. And it's something that I try to tell people, you got to really be on the lookout for those things because human beings are not robots. We're human. When somebody says to me in a negotiation, well, it's not personal, like, don't take it that. I'm like, listen, I can't separate me from me. Like,
Right.
it is what it is. And you bring those things to the table. And so it's very important. I often say to folks, when you're stuck in a negotiation, I would really encourage you to think, is there some way in which the intangible realm is playing a role here? Do they somehow feel, that you're trying to take advantage of them, whatever it might be? There's a whole host of those things, right? But those are what are really driving people in negotiation. And that's what we have to understand. It's a little bit like being a detective. When you sit down to negotiate with someone, you want to understand what your interests are, what all those things are. But your job in a negotiation is to understand their interests. And when you do, you kind of unlock doors often, that will enable you to get to a better place in negotiation when you understand all those underlying interests.
Yeah, I think that part of the story resonated with me because in the work that we do, we have something called scope and objectives. And the scope may be to build a building, but the objective is, why are you building that building? And I like to play what we call the why game. And so why are you building the building? It's, well, because we wanted to go from 3 campuses down to 1 campus. But why did you want to go to 1 campus? Oh, well, because we wanted to save money on transportation. Ah, okay.
Right.
So the real interest in this case is saving money on transportation.
Yep.
Right. So that really made sense to me.
Yeah. And that, by the way, that is exactly how you get to interest, is the why game, is to keep asking why until you can't ask anymore. Because now you're down to, the core interest. And like, for example, one interest that I see a lot, and we've been talking a little bit about engineers, is around risk, right? And sometimes, clients and engineering firms have very different views on risk. Well, if that's the case, right, now we've moved from a problem where neither one of us thinks there's a place to move, and yet now that I realize, actually, they're willing to take on the risk if I assume more cost. Like, that might work for me if I'm really concerned about the risk involved in a given situation, right? So it's that why game, it's that digging till you get down to that level to say, so now I understand why this is so important to you, like why I need to have this done by 5 p.m. Friday, right? Now, all of a sudden, I'm clear that it's because of this. That doesn't solve everything, but it fills a gap, right? It fills in, and it sort of says, okay, so the reason that they're pushing so hard for this is because of X, Y, and Z, and those are those interests.
You just mentioned that it's also important not to disrespect someone. And one of the things in the book was respect our way to yes, which is not to say we'll be accommodating, but how can we get to yes? What are some tips there?
Well, when we talk about respect, in many ways, we're talking about it because respect is a channel. It's a way of opening the other person up. All you have to do is flip it around. When someone's disrespected, there's nothing you can say unless you make amends, right? Unless you come back around and say, okay, like, I didn't mean to disrespect you. So I think if you see respect and treating the other the way you want to be treated, like, there's no better way to create a connection and a relationship with someone than doing that. And part of, and a lot of times we used to get the question a lot with the book, well, what if someone's being disrespectful to me? Like, why should I be respectful to them, right? I get it. But the answer is really, being respectful is actually, it's really more about you. It's about you achieving your objective, much more so. So it doesn't mean that you like them. It doesn't mean that, you approve of their behavior if they're being disrespectful to you. It just means you have an objective that you're trying to reach, and you're going to, keep respecting the other so that you can get there.
I wrote a bunch of things down in this chapter because, again, we touched on it just a little bit at the very beginning, and that is the political, the social, let's take politics out. The social arena we live in today, as you said, we're probably lacking a lot of that respect. And so these are some of the bullet items that I just thought, man, if people could follow these today, we'd be so much further down the path of finding harmony. But respect is simply to give value to the others as human beings. Listen attentively, listen to understand, not to refute.
Right.
Acknowledge the other and their point of view, even if you don't agree with it, just acknowledge it. Let them know that that you value them, and then be hard on the problem, not the person. And man, if we could just take some of those and go into our conversation with somebody we disagree with, either socially, politically, whatever those things are, but have these in the background, what a different conversation that would be.
I think that's right. And I think, I also, because as you might imagine, I get this question a lot, like, what do we do right now? And the first thing that I tend to say to people is, don't go into a conversation seeking to change the other person's mind, because it's not going to happen. And in fact, that's what alienates others, is when we try to convince the other person that they're wrong, because they believe what they believe as much as you do. So better to go in and say, I'm just going to see if I can learn something new here. And, part of the challenge is that when people, if you were to try to get someone to change their view, it goes much deeper than that, because it's about their identity, right? A lot of us are, we root politics or social elements of things into who we are. And so if we were to change our perspective, that means we have to rework everything we think and believe. And so what you're asking someone to do is much more dramatic than you realize. And so, to me, it's going in and doing some of those things of just like listening. I've always been a fan of stories, but I've been working more and more on this notion of the role of story, and stories are an amazing way of because they're universal. Every culture, every place uses stories to share. And I think if you can go into your conversations saying, I wonder what this person's story is. There's like a meme on the web. It says something along the lines of, be nice to everybody. They're carrying a burden that you're unaware of. And I think that in general, we all are. We all have this story and this narrative that, that's there and people don't know. And so if we can be listening for that, if we can realize that these people, generally speaking, care as much as X, Y, and Z as I do, then there are things that we can do. But I think the biggest thing is just to not seek to change each other's minds, but go in and try to learn something new.
I think that's a great perspective, because that I do think you're right. It's that people do want to change the other person's mind, and the reality is neither one of us are changing our minds. So you may as well just learn what the other perspective is. Mm-hmm. The essence of a positive no, you said, is to assert without rejecting. How do we accomplish that? Because obviously no comes across feeling as a rejection.
Well, there's a difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. And one of the ways that I love to explain this, that one of my colleagues shared with me, was assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Aggressiveness is standing on somebody else's toes.
Right.
And there's a very big difference there. And so what you need to learn to do is to assert for yourself. Like in negotiation, assertiveness is a really important part. If you're not clear what you want and what you need, and if you can't articulate that, then you're not going to get it. And there's a line, people often say, well, how do I do that? Like I gotta push back. I've got to, be combative. And I'm like, no, you don't. What you need to do is you need to express clearly what's important to you, but you don't need to hit them over the head with it. You don't need to push them in a direction. And that's the line, right? The line is, if I'm aggressive, I'm doing whatever I can in whatever way to get what I want. Assertiveness respects them and says they're going to have things that they need to get out of this situation as well. And so I think that's the key, is to say, and a lot of people struggle with that. I would say, that's one of the bigger problems that I find out there, is that people really struggle to assert well because they confuse the two. They think, I'm going to have to, beat this person up to get what I want. And it's like, no, you don't actually. You just need to be really clear and firm on what's important to you, and recognize that they're going to probably have the same thing that they need. And then the conversation is there a way that we can get there?
Yeah, I think this maybe dips into the art a bit, because it says one of the great arts in life is learning to disagree without being disagreeable. Right?
That's right. Yep.
Now, I was raised in the Deep South and kind of a nice culture, if you will. It's hard for me. It used to be a lot harder for me to say no. Mm-hmm. And so 2 things I read in the book I thought really would have helped me had I read this at a younger age. And one is saying no is essential to life. And it gives the cell membrane analogy of where the purpose of the cell membrane is to let in some nutrients and reject others, mm-hmm. right? Because this is helpful to me, this is not helpful to me. So I think so you're saying yes to something, you're saying no to others. It's essential to living, right?
Yeah.
And the other one is to think of your no not as a wall, but rather a strong living boundary that protects what is important. So in that case, I see a wall I can't see through, right? I can't see it. So there's no communication that can really happen without yelling. Whereas a boundary is a dividing line that I can reach across. We could pass knowledge back across. We can actually have a dialogue or a conversation. I think if I could have learned those much earlier in my life, I think I'd have been a lot better off.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think people, tend to see no sort of almost in absolute terms, or that it has to be this firewall. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that, when you understand the purpose of no, it becomes much easier to say it. That's the underlying yes piece to it, right? Is if I know why I'm saying no, then all of a sudden the no takes on much more meaning, and it becomes my friend, if you will. It's something that I know actually protects me, because we've all had that experience. I think maybe there's a few people out there who haven't, who have said yes to something they knew they should have said no to, and they walked out of the room and they kicked themselves, right? Like almost everybody's done that at one point in their life.
We all have.
Right? And so why to do that? Because you gave up on something that was really important to you. And that's not what negotiation is to me. This is a little different than the no, but people in negotiation tend to be really focused on compromise. And I think that that's a lazy way to negotiate. To me, negotiation is about creativity. So I wrote a book recently that came out last summer, and it's real world case studies of negotiation. And in all of those, in almost every one of those cases, had nothing to, they succeeded, but it had nothing to do with compromise. It had to do with creativity. It had to do with problem solving. And the best negotiators that I know and work with, it's all about that. It's about persistence, creativity, and problem solving. That combination is a surefire means to success when it comes to negotiation.
Yeah, I think another one of the hints that I read that I really liked was don't tell the other to stop doing something you don't want. Mm-hmm. Instead, ask them to start doing something you do want, right? And that kind of gets that small, it's such a small shift, but it seems really a different message gets sent.
Yeah, and framing, that gets to framing in negotiation, and framing is critically important. People don't spend nearly enough time thinking about framing in negotiation. But just as a quick example, like Kahneman and Tversky, two Nobel Prize winning economists, won the Nobel Prize because essentially what they found was that if you frame things in a negotiation or in a business situation as preventing against a loss as opposed to a potential gain, people are much more likely to say yes. So if you were to just think about your negotiations, if I can frame something as protecting you against losing something, as opposed to this is the potential benefit you can get, you're much more likely to say yes. So I think that when people are preparing or thinking about their negotiations, you should think about not just what it is that you want to say, but how do you want to say it? Like what's going to resonate with this other person and why? And that's where empathy and other kinds of things comes in, because you need to understand them.
Yeah, I saw a great example of that in one of the other books that I read where the person was a lifeguard, and she said that there's much research done around the fact that if you yell at kids, don't run, all they hear is run. But if you yell at them, walk, they hear walk. And so, not what I don't want you to do, what I do want you to do, so I think that's important.
Yeah.
Now, your latest book is called The Book of Real World Negotiations, as you just mentioned, and it uses real world examples rather than just hypothetical examples. Can you give us some, is there a favorite story yet in one of those?
There is a favorite story. There's a lot of great ones in there. And so these are just 25 cases. And part of the reason I wrote this is because there's not enough real world negotiation stories out there and examples. And a lot of times people will say to me, well, isn't this what negotiation is about? Isn't that? And there's a lot of popular misconceptions out there. And instead of sort of, going back and forth, I thought, let me just show people what effective negotiation looks like. So that's what the book is all about. The one case that I really like, it has to do with power and a scenario where a company didn't have any power. So the story, very briefly, is that there was a company that was working that was it was based in China, but owned partly by Australians and partly by Chinese, and they produced agricultural products, and they needed a big agricultural machine to do their work, and they had one, and it was beginning to break down, and so they had to buy a new one. And this is a multi-million-dollar purchase, and there's a lot of restrictions in China in terms of importing and things like that. And so there was one company in all of China that sold this equipment. It turned out that it was partly owned by the Chinese government, so they basically had a monopoly. So the company that needed to buy this equipment met with this company, and they said, look, we need to purchase this machinery. And they gave them a price that was almost 10 times what they had paid for the previous one. And they said, well, this is ridiculous. Like, we can't afford that. We'll go out of business. And they said, too bad, figure it out. So they called in a colleague of mine and they said, what do we do? And he said, well, we need to think about your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, what's your BATNA here? And they said, well, that's our problem. We don't have one. We can't import anything. They are the only one that sell this. So what do we do? And he said, look, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to leave for 3 days. And I want you to imagine that this company that sells this equipment has gone out of business and you need to still meet your needs. And they said, look, we got enough problems. Like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I'll be back in 3 days. And so he left and they were angry, frustrated. They're like, what the heck's this guy talking about? So then one of them said, look, we got to get down to work. How are we going to possibly do this? And they started to brainstorm and think. And then one of them said, after about a day of thinking together, one said, I wonder if there's anybody in China that already owns this machine and maybe would be willing to sell it. Nobody had any ideas. So they said, why don't you go look around? So the guy looks around and he ends up finding a company in Inner Mongolia, which is one of the provinces of China. And he reached out to them, and it turned out that they bought this equipment a couple years before, and they were changing their business model, so they actually wanted to sell it. So they talked about the possibility of purchasing it. So now they had this BATNA, right? They could buy the slightly used equipment from this other company. So they went back to the first company and they said, hey, we really need you to come off of your, pricing. We think you're trying to gouge us. And they said, well, we're not going to do that. I said, well, we've got a BATNA. We can buy the equipment from this other company. They said, we don't believe you. And they gave them the information and they checked it out and they said, okay, we see that you've got an alternative now. And so the company in China came way down in order to get the business. So it's an example of how, when you're dealing with a situation of not having power, you've got to think differently. You've got to think creatively about how do you change the game and how do you create a new level set. So I really like that one because it requires challenging your assumptions. It requires, thinking differently and pushing the limits on some level of that helps to change the dynamic between the parties and gets them to approach things differently.
I'm glad you used that story because that's actually one of the topics that I saw mentioned in the book that really appealed to me was this negotiating successfully in the face of power. Mm-hmm. So another topic that's in your book I think is interesting is achieving success when negotiating cross-culturally. And we touched on this a little bit earlier this morning, but I'm reminded of a recent guest I had, James Williams, who's the general manager for the Tokyo 2020 +1 now Summer Olympic Games for Coca-Cola. And we've done a lot of work in Japan. And we were discussing how semantics can trip you up, right? And so in Japanese, when you use the word hi, the person's looking at you nodding, going hi, and you're taking that to mean I agree when it doesn't. It just means I hear you, you're speaking words, I understand them, but they're not really agreeing. Right. And the other one is when they go, that will be difficult. Mm-hmm. What they're really saying is it's never going to happen, right? But you don't know that. So I think there must be some interesting stories in your book around that idea as well.
Yeah, and there's low context and high context is really what you're talking about. Low context cultures are ones where they're very direct. They say what they say, like in the United States. High context cultures are ones that are very different, where you have to sort of in a circumtitious kind of way get at the same idea. There is a very good case of a South Korean company and a German company trying to negotiate a partnership, and the German company completely took advantage of the South Korean company because the South Korean company was viewing the negotiation as sort of a big brother, little brother kind of scenario, that the German company was more powerful. So if the South Korean company acquiesced, the German company would take care of the South Korean company as part of any merger or something like that. But the German company had no idea about that norm, about that notion. And as a result, they reached agreement because the South Korean company acquiesced, but it could have been much better, much different, a much different scenario. So I think that when you're working cross-culturally, a lot of times we focus on behaviors, But there's a deeper notion when you're working cross-culturally that I think is really important. There's a guy named Edward Hall, who was an anthropologist in the 60s, who wrote a series of books on what he called deeper culture, about how societies organize themselves, the beliefs that they bring to the table, things along those lines that are actually much more of a danger in negotiation than just whether you shake, kiss, or bow, you know.
Josh, this has been really great. If people want to learn more about you and the work you do, how can they do that?
So I have a website that's got everything, all my books and training materials and my services that are out there, and that's just Joshua N as in Noah Weiss.com. That's the best way to find me. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Clint. I really appreciate you having me.
No, this is awesome, Josh. Thanks for the conversation.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.